video is all about the different literary genres that we are taught in most of our English classes. I hope you like it.
Just like at the beginning of this video said, this is going to be all about literary genre, and we're just going to review a little bit of knowledge that we already have in our noggin. So let's get started. The first thing that we need to define is what genre actually means. And genre, it can encompass anything that has to do with literature, arts, music, and basically it is the category of this art, music, literary composition that is characterized by its particular style, form, or content. And each genre, be it in literature, music, or art, has its own subgenre. Of course, today we're going to be talking about literary genres, and this is the way that I organize it. I divide it into nonfiction, which means writing that is true, fiction, that is writing that is imaginative and made up. Next, we have folklore, which are stories that are passed down orally from culture to culture, family to family, really depends on what story we're talking about. Next, we have drama, which is a play or a script. We could even include a little bit of television in that as well, since we need to have screenplays in movies and we need to have a script whenever we're talking about sitcoms and things like that. Next, we have poetry, which is writing that is concerned with the beauty of language. And lastly, we have graphic novels, which are a cartoon style literature that is longer in length with rich text. That's the last one that we're going to talk about. So let's get to the first one, which is nonfiction. Now, nonfiction's subgenres are informational writing, biography, autobiography, memoir, and essays. We're going to be a little bit out of order, but it doesn't matter. So a biography and an autobiography, sometimes people confuse the two because they are basically the same thing, except that what changes is who is doing the writing. When you have a biography, it is the true story of a person's life, and it's usually written in he or she, which is third person point of view. For example, His Excellency George Washington by Joseph J. Ellis, okay? So a biography is basically when somebody else writes somebody else's life story. Now, an autobiography is when you write your own life story, and this is written in first person point of view. I did it, me, my, etc. So now you know the difference. Biography means somebody else wrote it. Autobiography, I wrote it. For example, Trevor Noah's autobiography, Born a Crime. I'm sorry, my tongue is a little twisted today. It's okay. Next, we have memoirs, and memoirs are very similar to autobiography, except that autobiographies encompass a person's whole life story, while a memoir is a piece of the person's life story. And memoirs sometimes are written in first person. Usually they are written in first person. And most of the time they encompass a traumatic event in a person's life, a particular set of years in a person's life that created a certain impact, something big, something that changed their life forever and ever. For example, one of the most famous memoirs out there, When I Was Puerto Rican, by Esmeralda Santiago. We also have Eat, Pray, Love by Elizabeth Gilbert, which was turned into a major motion picture a couple years ago. Well, not a couple, some years ago. And Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird sings, because this one encompasses, if I am not mistaken, great part of her childhood up until the way she's like 18 years old, all right? Next, we have informational, reference, and essay in nonfiction. Informational writing are texts that provide information about a variety of topics. can be nature, technology, science, etc. Reference are books that provide information about different topics that are inside that same category. For example, an informational text could be a scientific article, while a reference book or a reference piece of literature could be a science textbook that encompasses, I don't know, terrestrial sciences, chemistry, etc. And next we have essays, which if you've watched my videos on effective essays, you know quite a bit about. And an essay is just a brief, see, this is what happens when you don't record in a long time. A brief piece of writing about a specific subject or topic. We can have persuasive essays, we can have informational essays, we can have narrative essays, descriptive essays, comparative essays, you name it, it probably exists in a category of essays. Now we're going to move on to fiction. And fiction has many more subgenres than I have described here, but these are the most popular ones. Shall we say we have horror, mystery, realistic fiction, historical fiction, fantasy, sci-fi or science fiction, and dystopian fantasy or dystopian literature. Let's first start with mystery and horror, great favorites of a lot of people. Ooh, excuse me. Now, horror is fiction that evokes the feeling of fright from both the characters that are in the story and the reader. And then mystery is fiction that has to do with the solution of a crime or an unraveling of secrets. The thing is that we can mix mystery and horror together because most of the time you will find a little bit of horror and a solution that needs to be found within many stories. In mystery, we can have The Hounds of Baskerville, written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. We also have The Murders in the Rue Morgue by Edgar Allan Poe, which is the first detective story, modern detective story. And this one has a little bit of horror as well. And The Vampire by John Polidori or Lord Byron. There is a literary gossip that Polidori stole it from Lord Byron, but we're not going to get into that. I'll make a video on Gothic literature later on. Followed by this, we have realistic fiction. And realistic fiction sometimes trumps people up because they are stories that could actually happen in real life, but they don't. They don't. The setting of the story is realistic. The characters speak like you and I speak, excuse me, and the story describes real life problems and events. So this is basically a story that even though it didn't happen, it could happen. It could be something that happened to your neighbor, to your friend, to your cousin, to your teacher, etc. And some examples for you are The Fault in Our Stars by John Green, Speak by Laurie Halse Anderson, The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Noah Chbosky, and Looking for Alaska by also John Green. John Green has fantastic realistic fiction. And all of these, if you've ever read them, they all are very personal to us because we read them and you could be talking about somebody that you know. Now, next we have historical fiction that a lot of the times people confuse with realistic fiction. Now, historical fiction is one of my favorite genres or subgenres as well. And it is a combination of imagination and fact with fictional characters and a plot that is centered in a historical setting. The characters usually can interact with historical characters, but mainly, our main character is not based on a real person. It might have some influences from other real people, but it's not a real person. So we have The Number of the Stars by Lois Lowry, Fever 1793 by Laurie Halse Anderson. She makes an appearance once again. A Picture of Freedom, The Diary of Clottie, a Slave Girl by Patricia C. McKissick. And all of these have to do with historical events. Sometimes our characters will interact with historical characters or historical figures, but not always. What makes a book historical fiction is the setting in which it takes place. You can have a story that takes place in 1960 something in the South, in Mississippi. And we know that during the 1960s, it was the civil rights era movement that so many people were rising up, so many people were opposing. That's what makes it historical, the context of where my story is taking place. Next, we have fantasy, another favorite of a lot of people. And this type of story, the author creates a magical world where anything is possible. You have magical beings like talking animals and other impossibilities. And yes, sometimes fantasy and fairy tales they tend to mix, and that's completely all right because once we talk about folklore, you will see why they kind of intermix. Some of the most famous fantasy books out there: the Harry Potter series, books 1 to 7 by J.K. Rowling, some of the most modern examples of fantasy. The Lord of the Rings, written by J.R.R. Tolkien. Good Lord, I will get in so much trouble because I said his name wrong. The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis, Tolkien's BFF, and his Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. All of these have fantasy elements: talking animals, dragons, witches, hobbits, trolls, ogres, etc. All of these have fantastical elements. Next, we have sci-fi or science fiction. Either of them is correct. And these are stories that are based on real or imagined inventions, usually have something to do with the future, or there is some setting of space travel, etc. And it often explores things that are unknown. Now, are there stories that they used to be classified as sci-fi and now they are not considered sci-fi? Yes. Some of them are still considered sci-fi because of some of the inventions that exist. But yes, 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 there are definitely a lot of stories that were written in the 1800s, 1900s that we have to find how to classify them differently now because most of the things that they describe in regards to inventions, they already been invented. Now, some examples for you: Frankenstein or Modern Day Prometheus by Mary Shelley. She is actually one of the first people that originated the genre, not Jules Verne. Next, we have The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. This one is still considered sci-fi because we do not have time travel, just like we cannot reanimate the dead, like in Frankenstein. And also we have 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. We also have Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne as well. There are some elements in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea that we cannot consider sci-fi anymore, but the majority of the book still holds up in the genre. Next, we have a recent addition, shall we say, and I use recent loosely because dystopian has existed for a long time, but now it's starting to become even more popular. And dystopian also takes place in the future. It's similar to sci-fi in this, except that in dystopian fiction or dystopian literature, Earth has gone through a disaster, a calamity, a fall, shall we say, and new societies, new countries, new cultures start to emerge. And dystopian is really interesting because it has a little bit of the previous subgenres that we discussed. It has some sci-fi, it has some fantasy, it can have some mystery, it can have horror, it can have a little bit of everything. But what makes it mainly dystopian is that Earth has gone through this calamity and now it needs to be maybe reestablished, repopulated, etc. It depends on the story that you're reading or the series. We have the Hunger Games series by Suzanne Collins. We also have The Giver by Lois Lowry. If you have not read The Giver, I definitely recommend it. And The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I believe that she has published a new one called The Commandments that is also in the Handmaid's Tale universe. Excellent, excellent, excellent example of dystopia since it is the fall of the United States and the new nation of Gilead emerges in The Handmaid's Tale. Next, we are going to talk about drama. And remember that drama needs to be one, presented to an audience, two, have a cast of characters, three, it may have a narrator who gives important information. This is usually very common in Greek tragedies when we have the Greek chorus. It has parts that are called acts or scenes, depends on the play that you are reading. Has props to help to support the action. For example, maybe it's a modern day play and the characters have cell phones as part of their props. The dialogue is what tells me what actors say, and the different stage directions are written in italics. My theory is acting up. For those of you that have seen my video of elements of drama, you are pretty familiar with this. Now, we have tragedy, which are literary works where my main character or main characters suffer ruin, extreme sorrow because of a tragic flaw, a moral weakness. For example, Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, Julius Caesar, even though Julius Caesar is not my main character, Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare. I have to put the bard in here because if not, I'll get in trouble. And also we have the Oedipus Rex trilogy by Sophocles. We have Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus King, or simply Oedipus, Antigone, and Oedipus at Colonus. All three of these are Greek plays written by Sophocles, many years ago. Next, we have comedy, which is the opposite of tragedy, duh. And these are stories that are meant to be funny. They are meant to be sarcastic. Usually they end with a happy ending, and its purpose is to entertain the audience. Many times, a comedy's purpose is to critique the society in which it takes place. So think about maybe plays that you've seen, modern day plays, and how they criticize the society in which you live. Again, we have our friend William Shakespeare making his appearance with A Midsummer Night's Dream, The Taming of the Shrew, Rosalind and Orlando, Much Ado About Nothing. There are many other examples, but I think that these are some of the most important ones. I would say that the most adapted one is The Taming of the Shrew, especially with the old movie 10 Things I Hate About You, and there are other versions, like Deliver Us from Eva. All of these things of literary genres, we can connect them to film one way or another. Now, in drama, we can have comedies and tragedies that either are a traditional play, which is broadcasted either over radio or the stage or television or film. And we can always have a skit, which is a short piece of comedy. We can also have a skit that's sad. And lastly, we have a musical. A musical can be either a play or a movie, which singing and dancing play an essential part of the way the story is developed. And very important, musicals actually developed themselves from light opera in the beginning of the 20th century. Next, we have my favorite, folklore or folk tales. And these are stories that originate from popular culture. Typically, they are passed down by word of mouth. The first ones are the ones that we usually learn when we are little kids, and those are fables. These are stories that teach us a lesson. The lesson at the end of a fable is either called a moral or a proverb. Fables come from all over the planet. And the most famous of them all, depending on where you live, is Aesop. Aesop is the most famous one, but we also have people like Rudyard Kipling, Jean de La Fontaine, Jean-Pierre Clary de Florian, who also have some pretty notable fables that maybe they're not as well known on this side of the world where I live. Maybe they are in the place where you live. Next, we have myths. And myths are one of my favorites inside of the folklore genre because they explain how early people found a way to say why the universe is the way that it is. Inside of a myth, you will find gods and goddesses or demigods also. And many times these gods and goddesses have human emotions. We see a little bit of magic, and sometimes we have gods and goddesses that disguise themselves. Like, for example, when we have the story of Arachne, which is more of a legend, but it's okay. Myths and legends, they sometimes are difficult to differentiate because they're very similar. But in the story of Arachne, which is the Greek story of how we have spiders, the goddess Athena appears first and disguises herself. And then she challenges Arachne to a weaving competition. You should check that story out. It's really good. Here are some examples from all around the world. We have the story of Huracan, which comes here from the Caribbean, where I am from. Osiris and Set, which is part of the creation story in Egypt. We have Ganesha and Moon from India. How the wagtail got its necklace. It's a type of bird from Africa. The different myths that surround Maui and Pele, that both come from Hawaii and Polynesia. We also have Hercules' deeds, that some of them can be considered myths, some of them can be considered legends from Greece. And we also have the story of Ra, which is part of Amun-Ra, the supreme god in Egypt. Here we have legends. And yes, legends and myths, sometimes they mix and match because we can have elements of both in a story. It's not a big deal. And legends are also stories that are passed down by people, but many times people tell them as a true story, and they often involve supernatural or religious elements. We have Lady Godiva, we have Robin Hood, The Fountain of Youth, The Legend of Atlantis, El Dorado, Sleepy Hollow, and El Chupacabra. All of these are told as if they were true stories, but we cannot 100% prove them. Next, we have fairy tales, and here is where we have the intermixing of fantasy and fairy tales. Fairy tales are those famous stories that begin with once upon a time, long, long ago, in a faraway land, right? And here we have the inclusion of magic or something enchanted. Many times we have a problem that needs to be solved, and everybody are supposed to live happily ever after, but not always. In fairy tales, we also have the number three that appears. Three wishes, three deeds, three little pigs, three Billy Goats Gruff, etc. We have Cinderella, or La Cendrillon, if you want to say it in French. We have Yen Chen, which is a Chinese Cinderella story. The Snow Queen, the basis of the famous movie Frozen. And the book A Thousand and One Nights, or it's also called sometimes Arabian Nights, but the correct name is A Thousand and One Nights, which has 1,001 stories. Next, we have tall tale, and these are stories that are usually popular in North America. Usually they are popular in North America. There are not many tall tales here in Puerto Rico, in the Caribbean. Some stories are exaggerated, but not as much as tall tales. And they are humorously exaggerated of exploits of North American frontiersmen, and particularly in the US. I would say that the most common tall tales come from the United States. We have Paul Bunyan, John Henry, Pecos Bill, Ichabod Crane, and the Headless Horseman. That one was written by Washington Irving. Next, we have everybody's favorite. I don't know why people don't like it, but poetry. Poetry is a literary work in which the expression of feelings and ideas are given intensity by the use of style and rhythm. And there are many, 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 many different types of poems. I'm only going to cover some of the ones that I find the most interesting. First, we have a couplet, which is two lines of verse that rhyme and form a unit alone or as part of the poem. Here we have two examples of couplets. I saw a little hermit crab. His coloring was also drab. So there we have the first rhyme sequence. It's hard to see the butterfly because it flies across the sky. And there we have another couplet. Next, we have the sonnet, which is a short, it's not that short, rhyming poem that has 14 lines. Yeah, they say it's 14 lines. Short, that's not short. The original sonnet form was invented in the 13th and 14th century by Dante Alighieri, the one that wrote the Divine Comedy, and the Italian philosopher Francesco Petrarch. But it remained very much unknown up until our friend Shakespeare, who decides to appear once again, that developed it in many of his poetry. Sonnets use iambic meter in each line and use line ending rhymes for the most part. I do not like sonnets. I do not care for them. We will not go into them too much. Next, we have haikus. And haikus, they seem very simple, but they're not. They are not. Haikus are an ancient form of poetry that is renowned for its small size and its precise punctuation and the syllables that are needed in the three lines that a haiku composes. Usually, haikus are written about nature and they are of ancient Asian origin. Everybody says that it's Japan, but it hasn't been 100% confirmed because Japan was a colonizer to other parts of Asia. So we're not sure what region of Asia it necessarily came from. Now, haikus are composed of three lines, like I said. The first line has 5 syllables, not 5 words, 5 syllables. When we write haikus, we need to be very precise in how we divide our syllables. And I'm doing the clapping motion because that is how I was taught how to divide syllables. The second line has 7 syllables, and the last line has 5 syllables. This is why haikus sometimes tend to be a little bit tricky for some people just because of this, because you need to count the syllables and not always is it easy to do the way that you were planning in your mind. Next, we have acrostics, where we have a poem where we write a vertical word and we think of words or sentences that we can pull out with each letter that is there. I would say that acrostics are some of the most well-used poems that exist in elementary school. Next, we have concrete poetry, which is beautiful, in my opinion. And concrete poems, you basically write a poem or a series of words forming the topic of your poem. For example, the example that I have here is talking about a rainbow. And if you notice, I lost my mouse, there we go. We have the person describing red, sweet as honey, bitter as blood, orange, fluttery as fall, still as stone, and so on and so forth, that it is forming the rainbow, which is the topic of my poem. Next, we have free verse. And free verse is a favorite of all of my students because it has no rules. There is no right way, there is no wrong way of writing free verse because free verse is whatever you want to make it. If you want it to have rhymes, that's great. If you want it to not have any rhyme, that's great too. There is no right or wrong way of doing it. Rhyming, syllable count, punctuation, number of lines, stanzas, etc. That is really up to whoever is doing writing. And now, last, we have the new and up and coming genre that is becoming extremely popular, and that is graphic novels. Graphic novels are something really, really interesting because you can have a graphic novel that encompasses the genre of drama. You can have a graphic novel that is realistic fiction. You can have a graphic novel that is historical fiction. You can have anything that is fiction encompassed in a graphic novel. What makes them so popular nowadays is because they are done in the style of a comic book. They are done in the style of a comic book. And it is different than a normal comic book or picture book because it has more panels. And if it has less panels, the panels have a lot more dialogue in between the different characters. And like I mentioned, they can encompass all other literary genres as long as it's fiction. Some classic examples: Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons, Mouse by Art Spiegelman, This One Summer by Mariko Tamaki and Jillian Tamaki, Blood Sad by Juan Diaz Canales and Juanjo Guarnido, Usagi Yojimbo by Stan Sakai. We can also include the Sin City stories. We can also include the V for Vendetta stories, etc. Graphic novels are starting to pick up lately because a lot of people are recognizing, shall we say, or many um, publishing houses are recognizing that many people are much more visual than they are just reading a plain old story. Well, that's pretty much it for today's lesson. I know it took a little bit longer than it usually takes, but it's a very long topic. So don't forget to like and subscribe and follow me on all of my social media platforms. You'll see them, I don't know, somewhere after my face. I'm out of practice out of these people. I hope you have a fantastic day. My name is Miss Adri, and I hope that I taught you something. Bye.